Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome to Future Forward, presented in partnership with the Institute of Leadership. In this special International Leadership Week edition, we're spotlighting bold ideas, global voices, and the legacies today's leaders are building for tomorrow. Today, I'm here with Vera Cherepanova. She's the Executive Director of Boards of the Future and a global expert in corporate ethics and compliance. She advises companies around the world, speaks at major international forums, and champions the role of compliance professionals in boardroom decision making, especially in the age of AI and in the future. Vera, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Marie. I'm really excited and I'm looking forward to share and contribute to the discussion with the audience.
Love it. Well, I would love to start with you've worked at the intersection of ethics and compliance for years. How do you define ethical leadership in today's business climate?
Well, that's a great question, and that's a difficult question because I do think that we are running into a lot of issues with leadership in general, and it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that we're facing a situation when leadership in corporations is on the brink of moral bankruptcy, if I might put it this way, because you can look at many surveys. If you want to be data driven, you can look at the surveys and see that the latest Edelman barometer showed that two-thirds of surveyed population do not trust corporate leadership because they find the statements that they make misleading and exaggerated. You can find other surveys that say, for example, another survey said that only 9% of the surveyed population believes that leaders are ethical and moral persons, which is pretty low. Yeah, so but also the general feeling in the air kind of tells us that there's something going wrong. And we had cases of, well, when the CEO was killed in the daylight in Manhattan, right, last year, and that was awful and that was shocking. But the thing that shocked me even more, and I know that I'm not alone here, is the reaction, because the person's behavior was considered so unethical and unjust that people literally thought it was a justified thing to happen, right? So, and this is really shocking, right? And this is very telling of the attitudes and sentiments right now in the society. And I don't think we're speaking only about the US. Um, we're speaking about the global situation, more or less. Well, I might not know what's happening in Asia because I don't necessarily go to that region, but Europe definitely something similar, and UK, and yeah. So, what is ethical leadership in all these circumstances? Oh, that's a really good and difficult question. I would probably say that an ethical leader should be ethical in two dimensions, right? So the ethicality of that person should come from two dimensions. So the first dimension is that that person needs to have ethical characteristics on a personal level, right? So the personal morals should be on a good level, right? So, and we're talking about the personality, the characteristics of the person. The second dimension is that those characteristics need to translate into how that person leads, right? So let's call these dimensions ethical person and an ethical leader, because sometimes, and I have seen situations like that, a person can be very, very moral and very ethical on a personal level, and in the personal life, that would be absolutely evident that that person is donating to charities, that person is going to church on Sunday morning, something like that, right? That person is like has kids and educating and bringing up the kids in a good supportive environment again, and teaching kids about personal moral characteristics, you name it, right? But when it comes to business, everything changes out of a sudden, and we see the behavior from a very different side, right? So both dimensions are very important. And I think that the definition of today's ethical leadership should be grounded in both of them, in both of them.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point. A lot of people are thinking about the United Healthcare CEO that was assassinated, and the response on social media has been really kind of astounding in both directions, right? There have pe been people who have said, they're almost celebrating it, and there are people on the other end who are talking about, the ethical point on the other end. How does a company get there? uh, and what can a company do to prevent that kind of magnitude of a compliance issue?
Well, authenticity is really lacking. I think we got into the situation, and I have these discussions with board members. I have to meet board members at this point of my career quite often. I do work with them almost on a weekly basis. So um, boards understand that the situation got really far in terms of promises and statements and pledges and commitments, but they still think that they need a skillful communicator. uh, they talk about how great it would be to have such a skillful communicator that whatever we put there, when something happens, it doesn't backfire. Because at this point of time, it does look like whatever companies are saying or not even saying, when something happens, let's say like some social issue, it backfires. Because if they say something, they are immediately held to account, and people would be like, ah, no, this is not authentic, something like that. If they're keeping silent and they're not putting any official statements, people would be like, ah, they don't care. They didn't even bother to put a statement, right? They just don't care about it, right? So it's a tricky situation, but I don't think that board members are actually looking in the right direction here, because skillful communicators, to a certain extent, bear the responsibility of getting us into this state, because there were a lot of statements, there were a lot of pledges, a lot of commitments, but most of them were made just to just copy what everybody else in the industry does, just showing that we kind of care about those things, but not necessarily changing the business model and the modus operandi, right? And inevitably, people got to realize that. People got to realize that was not authentic, that was not embedded in the business. Companies did not change the way they work to support those commitments, and that actually led to a crisis of trust that we have. Because if you think about trust in very simple terms, trust is a say-do gap, right? So when the say-do gap widens and becomes really, really wide, that's really bad. Yeah, because the say does not correspond to do, and companies are not walking the talk. So how to solve all that? I definitely think this is not about skillful communicators and having PR people on a speed dial, calling them every time when there's a social happening, and just putting up another statement. But I think it is a focus. The solution is the focus. Focusing on the things that you really stand for. And I think it requires going back to the very basics. When a company is being set up, when a business is being set up, there is always an idea who should be better off because of the business. Every founder has that idea. Who's going to be better off? Why am I doing it? And the second comes, what do I stand for, right? If this is my mission, what do I stand for while I'm trying to accomplish this mission, right? And this is really, really basic, but all of the ESG, all of the social commitments, or all of the ethicality, all of the integrity comes from there. Decide what you stand for, then stand for it, right? And then people will feel this authenticity. Then people will feel the connection between the two. Then people will understand why are you making those commitments, right? And you will actually embed them, because this is the basics of your organization. So why not? Yeah. So we stand for this, and we're gonna do that. So I just think that companies tried and leaders tried to cover so many things, but I have never actually seen a list of priorities of 50 items, right? This is not a list of priorities, right? A list of priorities like two things, three things. Well, I mean, five things as a max. All right. So again, going back to the basics, pushing it back to the core things that we stand for, and trying, yet actually trying to change the business if it's not in line with that, or if it is in line, to improve that, and you make it more salient and develop the idea.
That's excellent. And you and I have talked before about small businesses and compliance, which I always find a very interesting topic because as someone who started, I have a very small business, right? I used to be a solopreneur, now I have a team. And one of the things I find interesting is that, you say we should be talking about compliance every single day, right? Compliance should always be on the agenda. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I know from experience that a lot of small organizations are not very open to the discussion around ethics and compliance, because they say, oh, this is for big businesses. We don't have resources. We don't have budgets, for any kind of compliance people around, and having a formalized ethics and compliance program and something very, very elaborate, which is actually could not be further from the reality, because I do think that for smaller organizations, ethics and compliance work is much easier. It just has to be there, right? And I'm not talking about thousands of policies, some IT controls and things like that, which are um, relatively more relevant for the bigger organizations, for more bureaucracies, for more siloed organizations scattered around geographies and countries and subdivisions and whatnot. But with smaller organizations, again, this is very basic, and this all goes from the founder. It all goes from the leadership. If you spend 10 minutes at every of your management meetings on ethical questions and compliance, this is it. You have it. And again, for example, if we talk about code of conduct, uh, large organizations can be really elaborate on that document. I have seen code of conduct like 40 pages, 50 pages. I'm not going into discussion of how effective that volume is in my personal and professional experience, but this is absolutely out of reach and doesn't make any sense for a small organization. A code of conduct for a small organization can be like 10 commandments, just 10 commandments, 10 statements. We do this and we do not do that, right? And this is it. This is very, very approachable. It just needs to be there. And in those 10 minutes in management meetings, the leader can say, hey, so I don't know if we're like having any issues, having any concerns, something like that. And she can actually share some of her ideas on that front, or maybe an example when she was confronted with a difficult situation, a difficult choice, something personal, can go really well. Just again, to make it the topic of everyone's interest, to make it less intimidating, not to turn it into discussion like scapegoating, or like looking for like people doing wrong things, and probing people around for something, but just make it conversational and comfortable. And maybe in the first 5 meetings, nobody's gonna respond, and people will still shy away or something like that. But on the sixth meeting, I assure you, people will finally understand that the risks are not that high, and they will actually open up and speak up. And this is basically how you foster the speak up culture, just by making those conversations regular and comfortable. and not intimidating, right? So we're not talking about rocket science here. This is all very, very approachable for small organizations, mid-sized organizations, for everyone. It just needs to be there. The focus just needs to be there.
Yeah, it sounds to me like if you have a conversation when something comes up, it's almost too late, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because we're talking a lot these days about ethical foresight, because we kind of realize as a profession that what we've been doing for a couple of decades already was a compliance hindsight. Usually what happens is when there is a crisis, we're putting out the fires, right? How we see the future of the profession and how we see our role in the strategy of the organization, how we can turn the tables and actually present ethics and compliance as a more strategic enabler, but not as a technicality. And again, the firefighters who just try to put down the crisis, which already happened, right? So we need to have a lot more of an ethical foresight, and by we, I mean ethics and compliance people who need to think in scenarios, who need to be aware of where the company is going, what is the current strategy, what are the strategic objectives, and think in scenarios, what can potentially go wrong. It is a kind of a pre-mortem exercise, if you want, yeah? Thinking what can potentially go wrong, what ethical issues can we encounter on the way, and how do we make sure that this doesn't happen, right? And the second part of this is the senior leadership and the boards themselves. They also need to think in scenarios. They also need to apply this ethical foresight and think a little bit about how this can backfire, what the potential problems can be, right? And if we do this exercise on both sides, we're going to be much better in terms of how people perceive ethicality of leadership and integrity of leadership compared to today.
Excellent. Um, so let's talk a little bit about the Challenger. You've spoken a lot about the Challenger disaster and Wells Fargo scandal as failures of leadership, and talked about subcultures. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, the Challenger disaster. I think this case is cited in many publications because it's such a prominent one. But one of the sides which I like about it, not like, but maybe find relevant for the discussion around subcultures, which I found completely fascinating and not having the attention which the topic actually deserves, right? So there was an issue about reporting of so-called O-rings. So in a nutshell, the disaster could have been prevented if the people who were familiar with those problems with those O-rings would have raised those concerns. But the subculture in that division was different, and people were not expected to raise the problems and concerns. The personal stakes were too high. It was regarded as a career suicide, and nobody did that. So the person who knew that those O-rings are going to fail at the launch did not raise that issue, right? And so the disaster was not prevented. So the topic of subcultures is an interesting one because I hear a lot of talk about culture in general, and I hear it on all levels. Everyone is preoccupied and worried about the culture, right? Everyone understands that culture is a very big deal, right? Everyone understands that. I hear the discussions about culture on the level below the C-suite, so on the level of compliance people, HR people, risk people. Everyone is talking about culture and the importance of culture. They are applying slightly different lens because if I go to compliance people, they will call it ethical culture or unethical culture. If I go to HR, They would call it engagement and something like that, right? And speak up culture, and apply their terms. If I go to the risk department and talk to risk people, they will say this is a risk culture, right? And so on and so forth. But in a nutshell, we're at the end of the day looking at the same thing: the culture of the organization, the way we do things here, and this can have different attributes as I just mentioned. But this is the same culture. This is not such a thing like separate risk culture and separate ethical culture. This is just a general culture that can have those attributes or not. But the idea at the same time, the idea that a large organization has a monolithic culture across all of its functions, divisions, locations, subsidiaries, and whatnot is completely unrealistic. Completely unrealistic. The reality is that corporate culture is quite fragmented, and it can be really, really different depending on the specific unit we're looking at. And this can be a good thing, and this can be a bad thing. This can be a good thing because it can be used for the benefit of the organization. If the leadership is aware of the situation and is aware of the state of play of all of those subcultures, which requires certain work and which requires looking into the subcultures and compiling something like a map, maybe, of the organization to make it more visually understandable and graspable. And this can be used to the advantage. If we have all that, it can be used to the advantage. Let's imagine a situation: we want to launch a new product, or we want to launch a new process, or we want to change. We do business along certain things. We can do it in a subculture, right? If we have inside of the organization a subculture which is particularly good at risk taking, and having an appetite for innovation, we can use it as a test environment. We can use it as a pilot project and launch it there and see how it goes. And then if everything is okay and everything is great, we can apply this to the whole organization. This is one of the good ways. But subcultures, especially when nobody is looking into that subcultural map, and when leadership does not have any idea of the subculture as a concept and what kind of and types of subcultures the company is having, it can also be a very bad thing because I have seen, and I worked in ethics and compliance, so my background is specific to that area, so I can share a couple of examples what I have seen in that area. So I have seen many times that there is a faraway division with a relatively unethical culture, and with specific social norms that tell employees and that bribery or fraud or something like that, some kind of misbehavior is okay and is expected, right? And it is so embedded, and those norms are so institutionalized that people do not even question that, right? So, and given that the leadership has absolutely zero idea of subcultures and how to work with that, and nobody is looking, that subculture flourishes for years or even decades until somebody gets caught and there are DOJs at the company's door knocking and saying, hey, you're having systemic issues in your organization, right? So left unchecked, subcultures can also create problems for the whole organization, because if there is an investigation going on, this is a big deal for the whole organization and not only for that division, right? And the investigators are going to say, hey, yeah, you guys had a systemic issue. This is a cultural issue for the whole organization, which might sometimes be the case, but sometimes it might be not. Again, if we had that subdivision over there in that location having that issue, not necessarily we would have the same issue if we looked at other subdivisions, right? But given that the level of awareness about subcultures is really, really low at this point, which I find very worrying, and that needs to change. People would just make generic conclusions about that organization and what kind of culture it has.
Excellent. Really insightful stuff. How can people get in touch with you?
Oh, I'm everywhere these days, and I have a very big appetite for networking and meeting other people. I'm relatively new to the US, so I'm very keen to meet people based in the US. I'm on LinkedIn a lot. Please get in contact with me on LinkedIn. I'm writing a column. A column's name is Ask an Ethicist. I write it for Corporate Compliance Insights. I'm trying to present myself as a kind of a moral philosopher. So what I do, I have an email, a secret email, where you can send your ethical dilemma, and I would take that dilemma and provide a response, and also ask other readers to provide their responses if they want, publicly or privately, again using that secret email. So this is a fun exercise, and if you want to check it out and send me your dilemma, or maybe you have a response to the dilemma that I already discussed in one of the columns, I would be more than happy to have you there. Yeah, I'm at many conferences. I publish all that on LinkedIn, so you can always see where I'm going and where I'm traveling. I'm very friendly. Please come up. Let's do the hugs, handshakes, and everything. Yeah, so there are a lot of ways to connect with me, and I'm really looking forward to that.
Thank you so much for being with us today. This has been really insightful, and I have learned so much about compliance and ethics from you personally. And so I know everybody who does business, whether it's big or small, really needs to understand these concepts. So thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Marie. It was a pleasure.